Okay, then many thanks again for the invitation to act here as a replacement speaker, which is, of course, a great honor. As said before, I'm probably not really qualified to fully compensate for Miriam, but still I'll try to do my best and hope that this is sufficient at the end of the day. I let myself inspire a little bit by Miriam's prospective topic, which was about ecology and distribution, as far as I remember. And I wanted to bring in, as an additional perspective, something that probably connects me and the audience, namely pluralism. So I would like to give a primer on the climate crisis from a pluralist perspective. The agenda for this talk would be to talk a little bit about pluralism and how pluralism comes with appreciating different perspectives and how these different perspectives that we can take on socioeconomic subjects in turn shape how we conceptualize things, how we conceptualize solutions to problems, what we deem as relevant parts of reality. Then I want to speak shortly about the relation between ecological economics and other economic schools of thought and traditions to a little bit place ecological economics here in a theoretical context. And then I would like to give a summary on what, in my view, are piles of knowledge that are quite certain and quite helpful for getting a grip on understanding the climate crisis, probably not yet resolving it. So I would like to make a pluralist outlook on the climate crisis and also explain maybe how current the dominant economic thinking partially contributes to exacerbating the problem. And finally, in the last part of my talk, I want to show how to build a bridge from these more general considerations to specific problems. So what we'll try to look at in the last part is to derive pluralist policy suggestions in the spirit of a just transition to make a constructive approach to address the climate crisis, not only diagnose. So let me talk a little bit about pluralism. Pluralism means many things, but for once, it means to bring in or allow for taking different perspectives. And allowing for different perspectives can make things messy and complex. So my first point is pluralism is increasing complexity. Pluralism emphasizes that social reality has many facets, many layers, that social reality is coined by multi-causality, by dynamic interdependence, and by change over time. And appreciating these many facets, appreciating multi-causality, appreciating changing socio-historical context is a medicine. The factors, the different layers become difficult to entangle, and then we basically have two ways out. Either we go the standard economic way and try to do abstraction, the right kind of abstraction, hopefully, or we try to, at least in part, accept the additional complexity that comes with this many perspectives. And this is an insight that is very nicely captured in this quote, where it basically says, okay, when we accept these socioeconomic interdependencies and dynamic processes, we have also to accept that this cannot be put so easily into a rigid theoretical framework. We have to accept this additional complexity, but we hope to gain something, namely we hope to gain in relevance. And I think this is something that very much pertains to the climate crisis, because I think to address the climate crisis, we need to have a realistic account of the problem, and having a realistic understanding of the problem creates a certain degree of complexity, but is somewhat of a precondition to conceptualize adequate solutions. In this spirit, we would acknowledge and emphasize that part of this complexity comes from the fact that we cannot isolate the economy from its surroundings, that we cannot simply do or suggest that the economy is an isolated thing, but rather we have to accept that the economy, economic processes, economic activities are always embedded, and in our context, from a socio-economic pluralist perspective, they would be doubly embedded in society and nature. And this is also something that is emphasized in this classic paper by Rothschild I quoted on the first slide, where he says, okay, political economy is is coined by an awareness that political and other non-economic factors play an important role in shaping economic processes and results. So part of this accepting complexity means that we have to take into account this double embeddedness, and this brings us back to realism. Accepting complexity brings us closer to what is sometimes called real-world economics, in a form of economic theorizing that tries to take the world as it is and not start from a too idealized setting instead. When we talk about pluralism, we often find the argument that a pluralist way of thinking is a precondition to not only accept the diversity of perspectives on a given subject, but also to understand that given the complexity of the social sciences and economics, these multitude of perspectives are something that is not a problem, but maybe necessary and desirable, because as long as we don't have a theory or an approach that exhaustively explains social reality, and we think we are very, very far from that, it's probably helpful to have theories that can complement each other, that can help us to understand different parts of social reality, different contexts, different historically period. However, there's also one danger when we simply say that any perspective is of equal worth. It can easily lead to a situation where every one of us takes the perspective that is most pleasing to his or her own theoretical prejudices. So pluralism should really mean we have to appreciate this diversity of perspectives and have to appreciate complexity. And the danger probably is that it degenerates and then everyone picks that perspective that is simply reflecting his or her favorite view on the subject. And this is emphasized in my last quote here, namely that monism of theories can easily have the consequence of using facts only for illustrating or illustration or backup of the predominant theory, interpreting in a compliant way. There are many examples for this in the history of science. It's even mentioned in Kuhn's classic book on the structure of scientific revolution, where he basically says that paradigms represent worldviews or perspectives, and these different perspectives are so strong, they have such strong consequences that we observe different things even if we look at the same data. And he illustrated that with that picture puzzle here, Vexierbild in German, where depending on the perspective you take, it looks either like a duck or a rabbit. And basically pluralism now means that we acknowledge that both perspectives exist and not simply choose the duck perspective because we wanted to see a duck ex ante. We find examples of this in economic debates often. An example I often use is the elephant curve. It's also quite of an image. And as you know, the elephant curve represents growth rates for different percentiles of the global economy. So we see here that I think the time frame is 88 to 2008, that in these 20 years, at the middle of the income distribution, there was an income growth of about 60%. And the story that is typically attached to this is that we see, okay, basically poorer strata are catching up. So there is some convergence story typically attached to this picture. And then basically it said, okay, everything is actually working as it should. We have convergence. That's also something we would assume theoretically. And the only blind spot basically we have is that we have, so to say, also here a global economic elite that also profits very much from increased globalization. So that's the typical story, and it represents a certain perspective on the data. I would argue that this perspective is important, but it's not really describing exhaustively what's happening, because if we look at relative changes here, what we do not see are the huge disparities from which we start already in 1988, and which of course also map on absolute growth, whereas we have here only relative growth. And if we take that into account, we can ask ourselves, how big is the pie of total economic growth in these 20 years, and how is it distributed across different groups? And if we do that, we have this picture here where we see that basically more than half of the pie of global economic growth has been has found its way to the top 5% of the global income distribution. So I would argue that a pluralist perspective on this data would take into account of the elephant, but also take into account the giraffe that we can also observe in the very same data. Another completely different example of how perspectives matter can be found in behavioral economics. I found this cartoon here on the loss aversion, and I actually recognized it's really bad. I mean, if you look at the cartoon, you see winning and losing, and of course, winning is better than losing, so there's no surprise. So let's correct this. What should be the case here should not winning $10 is I don't care. Okay, I don't care much that I did not win the $10, but losing $10, this can cause anxiety, and this is basically the idea of the loss aversion. So for mainstream economists, this is a puzzle because this should be equivalent. There should not be these distinctive reactions. And what the mainstream economists typically say that loss aversion is a status quo bias. So basically, we want to retain the status quo, which is why we value the things that we already have higher than those that we not yet have. And the interesting thing here is that the word bias does not relate to statistics. It's not about a statistical bias or about a theoretical prejudice. It's really the subject that are biased. The bias is with reality. So in this perspective, we take the so to say, we take the classes that give us a certain theoretical view, and then we interpret the data or any observational statements in a way that is compliant with that perspective. And that does not only ensure that we, so to say, stick with our view, it also is somewhat cool because you have these classes. Again, we could ask, is there an alternative perspectives on this data? And in my view, we have an alternative in the realm of pluralist serializing. And one, I think, very promising is a rational heuristics approach, where we basically say, okay, humans do indeed act purposefully. They want to achieve goals. And in a rational heuristic approach, we will often we will assume that we use mental shortcuts for achieving such goals. These mental shortcuts are basically a mix out of individual learning and, so to say, evolutionary selection. And there we could say that maybe what is a bias in this perspective and what is actually a defect of subject somehow could be rationalized as sensible, purposeful action if we take into account uncertainty, because under uncertainty, we would probably value those things that we already have for sure, so to say, higher than, so to say, prospective gains in the future, or as it is phrased here, valuing the things we have higher protects us against the impacts of wrong expectations. This issue that we take a certain perspective on something empirically and we see different thing is also at the core of divergence between neoclassical economics at the one hand and ecological economics and socio-economics or pluralist economics at the other hand. And we see this in these basic conceptualizations of the economy. if you look at the early textbooks of ecological economics, you will typically find an identity creating differentiation where basically it is said that a key difference between neoclassical mainstream economics and ecological economics is that the former does not explicitly conceptualize any environment, whereas in ecological economics, the natural environment is explicitly modeled, integrated, uh, consecutively embedded in all theorizing empirical work and so on. And basically, pluralist economics or socio-economics takes up this criticism by ecological economics and, so to say, merges it with the criticism that a pure focus on the economy overlooks political and social factors that also will coin economic outcomes, and then we have this picture of a doubly embedded economy where society and nature matter. And again, we have, so to say, this key thing. There is something out there in the empirical world, but given our pre-analytical visions, as Schumpeter would have said, we simply see very different things in first instance. Now, now that I've approached, so basically the one key idea of ecological economics, let me shortly explain where I would position ecological economics from a pluralist perspective. So pluralism is somehow about bringing theories together, and indeed, if we look into the details, we observe that there exist many constructive interlinkages between ecological economics and other paradigms, and we can also identify some fields of tension. If you look at the relation between ecological economics and post-Keynesian economics, we see that there are certain similarities regarding the theory of action, uncertainty. There are similarities regarding the theory of production. In both contexts, increasing returns play a key role, and there is a shared concern for distributionalism. With feminist economics, ecological economics shares the idea that we have nature as a foundation of all life, and hence as a foundation of anything economic in any way. And another key similarity is that both are concerned with how we deal with stuff that is not marketized, maybe unpaid, and still has a foundational role for our socioeconomic existence. Then we can, of course, go beyond this old chart that takes a selection of heterodox schools to position it vis-a-vis the mainstream and see that there's also overlap to radical economics, for example, when it comes to how to analyzing sectoral interlinkages, when it comes to understanding the appropriation of labor and nature as some form of exploitation, or when it is about systemic analysis which would diagnose that some actors or maybe the system as a whole is forced to grow given the current regime of accumulation. There's also a shared area between ecological economists and evolutionary and institutional economics, which mainly relates to behavioral stuff, so consumer theory and how to behave in a way that increases individual and social welfare. And another area would relate to dynamic theorizing, namely that both paradigms think in terms of path dependence. And finally, there's also some overlap between ecological economics and the neoclassical orthodoxy, because both would, for instance, emphasize the role of scarcity and attached to that raise questions of valuation. However, mainstream economists and ecological economists raise these questions in a very different way. So this is already a field of tension also. There is typically a debate on what is scarcity, how should we conceptualize scarcity, and the key difference is that ecological economists would focus on absolute limit, like for 30 years ago expressed in the idea of peak oil, today expressed in the idea of planetary boundaries, whereas mainstream economists will always think in terms of relative scarcity, substitution, and the like. Another field of tension that regularly pops up on in heterodox conferences, I would say, is of course the field of tension between ecological economics and post-Keynesian economics. Ecological economics is very much about ensuring survival in the long run, whereas for many post-Keynesians in the long run, we're all dead anyway. And also many post-Keynesian macro models tend to assume that we have no relevant capacity constraints because capacity constraints are typically projected on the labor market, and then we see we have unemployment, so there are no constraints. But again, also having different thinking about periods in mind, ecological economists would probably be more skeptical on that, not maybe because of inflationary pressure, but because of this idea of absolute scarcity. So having positioned ecological economics as a key resource of pluralist theorizing, and also mapping a little bit the relations between ecological economics and other schools of thought, we can now take a pluralist outlook on the climate crisis, which basically means nothing more and nothing less than stating the obvious. So what we want to do here is simply be realistic about the state of affairs and pin down some key observations that, if we want it or not, have to be considered if we want to think constructively about this. The first lesson is we are already in a hurry because we have missed many opportunities. So I think these mitigation curves that you typically get from the IPCC reports or other academic literature are very instructive in showing us how many opportunities we have already missed. Because as you see here, if we started reducing carbon emissions strongly in the, say, early 2000s, we would have much smaller challenge because the mitigation curve is less steep than today, and today we really need a revolutionary change. I mean, look at these curves. It's quite clear to stay within the 1.5 degree boundary, it would require an Herculean effort. Yeah, and so it's really high time, and everyone who clues himself on the street because he thinks we have to do some panic reaction is probably in some way very correct on the empirics of the subject. Second lesson is there is no absolute decoupling. So we have decoupling in some sectors. We have decoupling for some countries in certain periods. But this decoupling is only relative, which means that we have that carbon emissions grow much slower than GDP, but absolute decoupling on a global level is still not in sight because the outsourcing of emissions, but also the catch-up of the global south creates additional emission that cannot be compensated by the very slow reduction rates we have in the global north. The third lesson is that distribution matters. If we look into the data, we regularly find that extreme inequality in income and wealth, and we have extreme inequality in income and wealth because both variables follow a power law distribution at the top, which means that, yeah, which is just a mathematical way of saying that we have extreme inequality, where the highest values are many orders of magnitude larger than mean or median values. And this extreme inequality also maps onto emissions. So we see here Lorentz curves for different consumption categories, and we see that typically the more carbon intensive some consumption category is, the more unequally this is distributed, a pattern that is heavily driven by mobility patterns, because simply rich people move so much more, fly so much more, travel so much. The fourth lesson is, even if we manage to get the carbon thing covered, which, as I said, the 2 slides before, would require a major effort and also a true change in the way we organize our socioeconomic provisioning systems and our ways of life, there is still the minor detail that all other extraction issues remain unresolved. So basically, if you look at other areas of extraction or sink use, if you look at the planetary boundaries that are not related to climate heating, then we see typically that the time series do not change because there is no political effort to change them, and without this political effort, we would not have been in a position to get the relative decoupling that we today observe, at least in the global north. Yeah, and finally, if we look in the policy debates, we have to diagnose that mainstream economics, economic thinking, is part of the problem. What you see here is a quote from William Nordhaus in his Nobel Prize paper on climate change published in the American Economic Review. And he says that another finding, much more controversial, is that the cost-benefit optimum rises to over 3 degrees in 2100, much higher than policy targets. Even with a more pessimistic damage function, the temperature path still rises to 3 degrees of global warming. The optimal carbon price is estimated to be $36. However, we can get higher prices if we impose higher targets. So basically, this kind of reasoning, social cost of carbon, impact assessment models, is very much coining political discussions. And if we look closer into this, we find that there are a series of theoretical or even normative prejudices read into this approach. We basically would say, start from the observation that there's nothing special about nature. Nature is a commodity, just any other as any other commodity is a commodity. This might not sound too problematic at first sight, but if you take into account what is typically assumed, then we see that, for example, every commodity is in some way substitutable. So we would have we would have to acknowledge that nature is somehow a commodity for which there is very inelastic demand. And this is, so to say, not really taking into account that nature is not substitutable in a strict sense. Also, the idea of calculating an optimum is a theoretical presumption that basically influences policy debates. I have, 2 years ago, I've been at a panel discussion where an optimistic entrepreneur said, you know, all this climate problem is really easy to fix. We just have to find the correct price. And then you see how, so to say, how strongly these kind of models and this kind of theories and argumentation that's in the built into the mainstream kind of thinking also coins policy debates, because that exactly is what the idea of an optimum conveys. You can find an optimum, the best way out of a problem, and you only have to use one variable in order to reach that optimum. And this is a very, so to say, a very attractive vision, because people say, okay, it's a well-defined problem. I have one lure, I have one target, I've just to get the lure right, and then everything will work. The next question we could ask is, why is there such a low price estimated for a ton of carbon? Two factors are coming in here. One is substitutability, I already mentioned. Another is temporal discounting. So basically, all these estimates hinge on our assumption on temporal discounting and will reflect basically how much patience or impatience we want to impose on the underlying utility function. Also, in political terms, what emerges from this is, of course, a preference for market-based solutions. If we have to find the right price, we have to use markets because Econ 101, only markets can find the correct price. Yeah? That is the reasoning, and this is also directly translating into policy. So basically, what economists then say is, okay, basically, we want to do it with the price, but we cannot. But what we actually can sort of say limit is the quantity Q, and then we limit the quantity by means of an emission trading system. And then within this emission trading system, the market will find the right price. This is the prevalent policy solutions over the last 2 or 3 decades. And again, the perspectives matter because the simple alternative solution would have been imposing a price path. So there is a very simple alternative to cap and trade, which would simply be price regulation. Maybe price regulation is for some reason inferior, but given the uncertainty of future developments, it would be something that could be projected in the future in a reliable way, which is not really possible with the ETS because, as you might know, the prices reached by the ETS are very much driven by market moods, by speculation, and the like, and are also typically effective only in the short run. Against this backdrop, a question that repeatedly arises is, okay, but if you don't like this approach that focuses on an optimum that is to be achieved or that is to be reached, how would you proceed elsewhere? And in my view, this is something where we need an answer. So we need an answer on how to conceptualize rationality in a pluralist approach. And one way to do so would be to focus on uncertainty and say that, okay, I cannot do optimizing calculus when I don't really know the probabilities. And in reality, come on, I do not know the probabilities. So I cannot really calculate expectation values. But what I can still try to do is devise scenarios, and across these scenarios, I can try to avoid the very bad states, okay? Again, we could, with evolutionary economics, frame this as a rational heuristic, something like avoid the disaster or avoid the worst outcome. We can also speak with statisticians and call it a maximin solution. So we should, if we're uncertain about the outcomes, we should choose that path where the worst outcome is best. And we also find that notion in ecological economics. In a classic paper by Robert Costanza in 1989, in the first issue of Ecological Economics, he pinned down that table and said, okay, let's assume there's uncertainty. Today we know that whether technological optimists or technological pessimists are right. Let's, so to say, assume there's uncertainty about that. But we have to decide on a policy today, which is actually 35 years back now. And then he says, okay, even if there is uncertainty about what is the real state of the world, we should simply check in which column is the worst outcome. Here is the worst outcome, which is the disaster, which occurs when we do an optimist policy, but the pessimists are right, because then we lose our planetary foundations for life. And so there is a rational argument, or there is an argument to make why it is rational to focus on a pessimist policy. Okay, that is a simple argument on how alternative conceptualizations of rationality could look like, taking into account real-world factors like uncertainty and how this would map onto the climate crisis. It's all there. The answers are out there. Exactly. If we approach the thing from that perspective and bring in this notion of avoiding worst cases, the greatest worst case is, of course, extinction. And again, this is something that is known to many for a long time. If you look uh, in biology, how optimization is conceptualized there, we will quickly find references to the very same approach to rationality we just mapped. So we can draw on classically heterodox sources, we can draw on biology, we can draw on the rational heuristics approach that is also prominent in psychology, and we will find that, so to say, this kind of thinking, avoiding worst outcomes, is judged as something rational in many contexts. And even if we take, so to say, this more biological approach, this safety first approach, this avoid extinction approach, or as the mathematicians like to say, avoid gambler's ruin, conceptually, these are all the same problems. There is no discount rate in the traditional sense. But even if we would like to explore the middle ground between, so to say, this extreme position and what is done in the mainstream, there are interesting papers out there that tell us how much, so basically our estimates of what is the value of avoiding an additional emission of 1 ton of carbon, how much these estimates vary with the discount rates we use and employ. Okay, I hope you're still with me. We are now coming to the solutions. So as you might have guessed, these problems are problems that plague and me for some time and that I'm concerned with for some time. And basically my basic heuristic for coming to grips with this is the donut, where we basically say, okay, we have to find ways of living which do not transgress these planetary boundaries, but at the same time provide societal and material foundations that allow for a certain level of well-being. And for me, also taking into account the findings we saw about how distribution maps onto emissions, for me, the clear-cut implication is to think in terms of a just transition, to think in terms of win-win strategies. So how can we capture low-hanging fruits that will improve both our environmental position and our social cohesion? I think there are many research options and pathways from a pluralist perspective. So things that I would be interested in, or I've worked in the past, are how international trade and the associated race for the best locations intensifies social as well as ecological problems. Another question that's complicated actually is whether working time reduction, whether and to what extent working time reduction might be part of the solution, and how this might impact on well-being. And so basically the idea to have more leisure time, and this could probably increase well-being. But it does not work if everybody goes shopping in the leisure time. So there is some tension here. Another policy route that I would be interested, or I'm interested to explore, are smart tax policies that could foster such a just transition. A key topic here that I will talk a little bit about in the remainder is a wealth tax, which could both dampen consumption at the top and at the same time free up resources to confront the climate crisis, but also progressive taxes on specific consumption categories could be an idea to bring things forward, and so basically to have a tax system that places the incentives at the right spot. And finally, I think for turning the tide on the climate crisis, we need an active public sector. We need what Mariana Mazzucato sometimes has called mission-oriented policies. So we need a public sector that is willing to invest and to roll out regulations to ensure that all the available low-hanging fruits, technological options are put into place so that we can reduce emissions as fast as possible. Yeah, as told before, these kind of problems and also the possible solutions coin my research agenda for several years now. We have worked in different directions. Here are three examples. We have looked at the question whether the European Green Deal is enough, if it's really sufficient to get this turned on. We have looked at the question whether a massive expansion of public investment could be, so to say, could be executed in a way that is also fiscally sustainable. And we have looked at the prospects of a European wealth tax. Since these are a completed project, and since then we have done a little more. And in the remainder of my talk, I would like to talk a little bit about this wealth tax project as a possible solution, and then about a second project that is not mentioned here, where we are concerned with getting the German residential building sector carbon neutral. Our study on the wealth tax was motivated by the finding that we found a significant green investment gap when analyzing, so to say, investment requirements on the one hand and comparing them with the planned volume of the European Green Deal. These estimates are fluctuating widely, but we get a significant difference from either 250 of reaching from 250 to 600 billion, depending on which estimates we use. And basically, these are the missing funds for getting Europe carbon neutral in time, building on basically what the Commission says about these investment requirements. And what the Commission says in the sense of all studies and so that are available in this context is not really fully consistent. So the question we raised, whether a wealth tax could be a remedy to fill this gap. And here you have some typical reasons why it could make economic sense to introduce a wealth tax. Traditionally, we would say that richer households have a stronger ability to pay, and also wealth tax make our tax systems more progressive because they are not so progressive anyway. If we view them in the aggregate, so also taking into account consumption taxes and the like. And then a new reason is increasingly popping up, namely that wealth inequality is itself seen or recognized as an ecological burden, which led to a certain kind of political and normative reevaluation against the background of how distributional relations map onto emissions. And then a second key group of reasons is basically this kind of strengthening Europe and especially preparing Europe and its political institutions to confront future challenges. And here we could need basically funds from a wealth tax to compensate the investment gap I just mentioned. Yeah, what we then do now is simply taking the survey data that exists for private wealth on Europe, which is collected by the European Central Bank and published as the Household Finance and Consumption Survey. And then we would like to calculate tax revenues from this data. However, this does not really work. Yeah, now it comes, now you see how this kind of motivation to work on applied problems that are hopefully somehow relevant to the current state of the world directly at some point will bring you to an economic or technical problem. So if you take the HFCS as a data source, you will typically find that the data at the top of the distribution is really weak. So the richest Austrian here in this sample has about 18 million, but the richest Austrian in reality has a factor 1,000 more. He has 18 billion rather, about this size. So we are missing quite a bit at the top. These are the so-called missing rich. And the existence of this missing rich has motivated a research line over the past years that we now map onto this issue of climate crisis. We could do I could do a longer discussion and talk now why this is the case and why this actually must be the case. But for now, I will leave it at 2 comments. So typically, we cannot observe the top of such a power law distribution as we see it here for the Austrian distribution of wealth, because random sampling is simply ill-suited to deliver an accurate picture of this upper part of the distribution, because the random sample cannot really deal with the high variation we observe at the upper end. And then there is, of course, the practical problem that richer households have a smaller probability to respond in a wealth survey, which again is then a measure as a selection bias and causes a downward bias in your measurements. Good news is now that we and others developed a method to repair this, and basically the method is based on the idea that we can estimate the power law that is underlying the top of the distribution, and because the data itself is biased and we cannot be sure whether the distribution represented by the data is really reliable, it is typically to amend the observation data with observations from rich list. And by combining the rich list data, so like Forbes list or so, with the survey data, you get a new perspective on measuring wealth concentration, which allows you, in many cases, not every time, to extract quite plausible estimates. Leaving the technical details aside, by means of this statistical estimation that uses survey data and rich list, we can arrive at an estimate for how steep, how strong the inequality at the top of the distribution is, and can use this information to create supplementary data that better describes, or that then describes this missing rich that are not covered by the original survey. If we do that, we find that the top 1% of wealth holders in Europe holds about 32% of wealth, which is probably still too low. But to give you an idea, I think in the raw data, the same number is about 18% or 16% or something, so much smaller. Well, the poorer half, this is a typical finding, the poorer half of any population basically holds no relevant wealth. And we also find that a European wealth tech could bring substantial revenues, depending on the design, between 200 and more than 1,000 billion euros. Typically, you would say that everybody who has a wealth below some threshold value is exempted. And we see that if we, for example, would use a threshold value of 1 million euro net wealth, such a tax would only be paid by the richest 3% of the population, so quite a high revenue for taking into account the fact that only a small proportion of the population is affected. Yeah, here are the detailed results on the wealth distributions we get for all the country for which we have data. And here are the detailed result on the tax revenues. You see here that the raw data typically gives much smaller estimates than the corrected data we produce. And what we then do is that we also add evasion effects. And then we would typically say, okay, a realistic outlook on the revenues is taking into account both the statistical correction and small or moderate evasion effects. And then you see here that for these different tax models, you will arrive at quite substantial revenues. For the less radical models, say the upper three models, it's between 200 and 400 billion, which could already contribute a lot to closing the gap we mentioned at the beginning of this part. A final example in my last minutes. Another thing that we were concerned with is the greening of the residential sector. One thing that we would also draw from a pluralist approach is that sectors are actually quite heterogeneous, especially as it regards the environmental footprint. So a general hunch in our research is that we have to devise sector-specific transformation strategies. And we wanted to focus on one, which is already super well researched, namely the residential sector. We just knew there were a lot of studies out there looking at the residential sector, and we wanted to take answers from there, actually, and then fill in the gaps by thinking about how these results, these studies get map onto the question of a just transition. Yeah, but then we read all these studies and we did not trust them at the end of the day. So these studies are difficult to compare and synthesize. They are very heterogeneous in the terms of approaches and assumption and not directly comparable. Current studies are not really transparent. We do not know how they arrive at their results. And all of these studies have important omission. This was actually a starting point, namely this distributional aspect. So what we found is a typical thing in science. You think there is reliable work you can build on, and then you find that it's simply not there. And you have to start from zero, which is what we did in this project. So we got ourselves some data on the German housing sector, and we built our own framework for analyzing how renovation, exchanges of heating systems, and also decarbonization of energy provision would affect the emission impact of the building sector. So we found that we have to build everything from zero. Here are, so to say, some main findings. So what we assumed, or what we put together here, is that we basically said, okay, we will have to improve insulation up to a certain technical standard, and we will have to equip all buildings with either heating pumps or district heating, because these are the only energy sources you can credibly claim to maybe decarbonize if you do it right. Second thing is that we found we need a prioritization of renovations, so we can clearly show that the worst performing buildings have to be renovated first, if this should be done in time. And as already emphasized, we need additional decarbonization efforts outside of the housing sector, because these technologies here will rely on external energy provision. And if this external energy provision is not emission neutral, it will just be an outsourcing of emissions and not really contribute to reaching climate goals. And based on this assumption, we calculate what renovation rate, what intensity of renovation efforts is necessary in Germany for this carbon neutral residential sector to be realized in time. And what we found is that we need to scale up the renovation rate to at least 3%. We need this additional decarbonization, and we need this prioritization of renovations. And then it's doable. It's really still doable, but it's already quite tight. So waiting for another 5 years, this study would deliver quite different results. So here you see basically some of the results, two charts showing a timeline till 2055. In gray, we have the climate goals. So this is the area where we want to get. And what you see in the left chart is that by scaling up renovation rates, by renovating more houses, we can get closer to the climate goals. But without an additional decarbonization, which you see here in orange, we won't make it even if we scale up to 3%. And here basically you see that to be in line with these climate goals, you need this renovation rate of 3%, and you need to fully decarbonize the provision of both electricity and district heat. in this scenario. This was quite an effort. So for doing that, we needed data on residential units in Germany. We needed data on how different energy sources map onto the carbon footprint. And what we basically then do is to try to create a representative data set that we take as representative for the German residential sector. And then we calculate how much would the renovation of some building contribute relatively to the reduction of carbon emissions. And so we can calculate these renovation costs needed. And then, as we are economists, we also calculate the associated costs. We use an IO model to look how does this impact on growth and employment and so. But more importantly, we also ask, who pays? The question who pays is quite important because think about it. We are just saying, let's put public investments, let's intensify renovations in the housing sector, and public investments could be, of course, a key source for speeding up this transition. But the problem might be that wealth distribution is highly unequal. So if we simply say, okay, let's put public funds into improving the residential sector to get this carbon neutral state of affairs and simply use public subsidies for that, what we would do at the end of the day is to subsidize private wealth and to subsidize existing increase existing inequalities. So there has to be a solution for that. And what we developed in our policy paper is to simply say that we need a just transition approach here. And we suggest to base that on the wealth distribution. So basically everyone who either wants to or has to renovate his or her building can fill out a form, and on the basis of that form, that household is located to be positioned somewhere in the wealth distribution, and then we simply suggest that the amount of subsidy one gets for the renovation measure depends exactly on that, on the relative position in the wealth distribution. In this example, you see that we would provide full subsidies for the poorer 2/3 of the population. We would provide no subsidies for the top 10%, and in between we could do a linear interpolation. And if we do that, we find that basically only about a quarter to a third of the total costs would occur to the public sector, whereas the rest would be financed by those at the top of the wealth distribution. Okay, that's it. How does this map back on pluralism, especially in the context of the project on the residential sector? I'm sometimes asked, Jacob, isn't this a bit strongly focused? Isn't this a bit too pragmatic? Where is the pluralist spirit in this project? And my response to such questions is always, if we cannot find the relevance of pluralism in specific applied problems, then pluralism is maybe nonsensical. And actually, we had a lot of instances where we, so to say, fell back on the different perspectives I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. So here are some examples how this question of different paradigmatic perspectives popped up in the residential sector project. So one was that we take climate goals explicitly as external input as an absolute constraint, whereas many other models would, in a more neoclassical spirit, derive the goal from optimization. No, we do not do that. We simply use the policy goals that are more inspired by the natural sciences, and hence make this notion of absolute planetary constraints explicit. It's basically a foundational corner of a modeling approach. At the same time, maybe it's something that will at some point provoke criticism from some mainstream person. A second thing where this popped up is in the question on how to conceptualize these transition costs, the costs associated with the investments needed. And there again, the question, should we use discounted or not discounted costs? In our context, this did not matter so much for the grand evaluation of the social cost of carbon. In our context, this pertained to the question of how do households decide on investments in their residential objects. Most studies use discounted values because they say, household is rational and the household will recognize that buying a heating pump will induce a lot of savings and hence we can subtract these savings. But in practice, I don't think that most private homeowners think that way, and hence we choose not to use no discounting, simply because we thought it would lead to a more realistic representation of a state of affairs. Paradigmatic differences also popped up in the context of the text base and the economic effects. With regard to the text base, many see it as super controversial to, so to say, base or the text base is probably wrong, the subsidy base would it be? So why do you justify, so to say, connecting the subsidy received to the wealth position? Shouldn't we base that on income as with all other, or as with many other things, public contributions? And in our view, it's simply consequent to focus on wealth, because such a public subsidy for renovating my home would be a subsidy of my stocks, of my assets, and hence we should remain on this level of stocks. With the economic effects of public investment, there's of course the old controversy: is it good or bad? If I want to, or if I think it's probably a good thing, then I will use this more Leontief style of modeling, where you have typically then expansion of GDP. If I'm skeptical whether the public sector will do the right thing, I can use a computable general equilibrium model and show that the economy will shrink if the public sector expands too much. And finally, as you might have recognized, so the main technical exercise of this residential sector study is really a green growth story, because we tell you something about heating pumps and district heating and insulation and construction and and there is not, in the technical part, there is not much sufficiency. But when we turn to our estimates on the employment that is needed for getting all these additional renovations done, and for basically bringing the buildings we have into a shape that is future fit, then we of course have a very important sufficiency dimension, because the great role for sufficiency in the housing sector, in my view, is not doing smaller or doing less insulation or less exchange of heating pumps, but the key variable here is to reduce the construction of new buildings, which is by far the most emission-intensive activity. So basically, bringing workforce away from the construction of new stuff and into the renovation business, into the business of exchanging heating systems, this would be the analogy to repair versus produce in the consumer goods sector. So, yeah, this is it. Many thanks for your attention in German. I hope